I never had a wife, and in those days the mountains seemed to know it, holding their silence a little longer around my cabin as if they were listening to a truth I had never spoken aloud. Snow lay thick on the pine branches, bending them into quiet bows, and the morning light moved slowly across the clearing, pale and patient, like it had nowhere else to be. I had learned to live inside that stillness. It asked nothing of me, and I asked nothing back. My name was Caleb Whitmore, though most folks in town said it like a caution rather than a greeting. 33 winters had shaped me into something solid and reserved, a man broad in the shoulders, careful in his steps, and measured in his words. I had land enough to matter and coin enough to survive any season, yet I lived alone beyond the ridge, where the road thinned and judgment could not easily follow. People believed solitude suited me, and over time I let that belief harden, because it spared me the disappointment of being misunderstood. Town days were rare and brief. I would ride in, trade pelts, collect supplies, and leave before conversations grew curious. I felt eyes on me then, measuring what kind of man chooses quiet over company. Some said I was too stern, others that I was hiding something broken. None of them were entirely wrong. I carried my loneliness the way some men carry scars, privately and without ceremony, convinced that naming it would give it too much power. It was on one of those winter visits that I first saw her standing apart from the others, as if the cold itself had pushed her to the edge of the street. Eliza May Holloway was 27, though hardship had already written lines of caution around her eyes. Snow clung to the hem of her dress, and she held a small bundle close to her chest like it might slip away if she loosened her grip. People passed her without slowing, their glances sharp with rumor, softer with pity, but never kind. I did not know her story then, only the way her shoulders curved inward, as if she were apologizing for taking up space. A woman near the mercantile whispered something behind her glove, and the sound carried farther than it should have in the cold air. Eliza flinched, and in that small movement I recognized a familiar shape of pain, the kind that comes from being seen but never chosen. Something in me shifted, subtle as a change in wind, and I found myself watching her long after I had finished my business. By the time dusk settled, the temperature had dropped hard and fast. Eliza still stood there, uncertainty rooting her in place more firmly than fear. When I approached, she looked up with guarded eyes, ready for refusal before I spoke. I told her winter was no season for standing still, and that I had a cabin where the fire stayed lit. I did not offer explanations, and she did not ask. Relief crossed her face like a shadow passing, brief but unmistakable. The ride to my cabin was slow. Snow muffled the world, and the only sound between us was the horse's steady breath. I sensed her measuring me the way one measures thin ice, careful where to place her trust. When we arrived, I showed her where to set her things, placed a blanket near the hearth, and turned my back so she could eat without feeling watched. Respect, I had learned, was often louder than reassurance. Days settled into one another with the rhythm of falling snow. Eliza moved quietly through the cabin, never assuming welcome, never demanding space. I noticed how she washed her cup after every meal, how she thanked me for ordinary things, as if kindness were a debt she feared she could not repay. In her presence, my solitude changed shape. It no longer felt like a shield, but like a room waiting to be filled. I sensed the town's judgment even from miles away, as though its whispers could travel on the wind. I knew what they would say about a man like me sheltering a woman like her. Yet each evening, as the fire warmed the walls and Eliza's breathing softened into sleep, I felt something steadier than doubt take root. The world beyond my door had never offered me belonging. As the snow deepened outside, I began to understand that perhaps belonging was not found, but quietly made. The nights were longest then, stretched thin by wind that tested every seam of the cabin, yet she never complained. Sometimes our eyes met across the fire, and we would look away at the same moment, as if the feeling passing between us were too new to be trusted. I told myself it was only responsibility, only decency, but the truth settled deeper with each shared silence. I had lived many years believing I was made to endure rather than to belong. With Eliza beneath my roof, that belief began to loosen, not enough to break, but enough to let in a careful, unfamiliar hope that asked me to stay awake a little longer, listening to the snow, wondering what might come next. It was not love yet, only the beginning of something neither of us dared name. I woke one morning to the sound of Eliza coughing, sharp and shallow, like the cold had finally found a weakness in her chest. The fire had burned low in the night, and frost traced pale veins along the window. I rose without thinking, fed the flames, and set water to boil, my movements steady though worry pressed behind my ribs. She apologized between breaths, as if sickness were a moral failing. I told her nothing, only held the cup while she drank, watching color slowly return to her face, realizing how easily silence could turn into fear when someone finally mattered. The days that followed carried a careful tenderness. Eliza grew stronger, and with strength came a quiet confidence that changed the way she stood and spoke. She no longer asked permission to help. She simply did, her hands sure, her presence easing into the spaces I had once guarded. We spoke more then, not of our pasts in detail, but of small things that revealed larger truths. She loved the sound of wind through pine needles. I admitted I had always feared returning to an empty cabin. Those admissions felt heavier than confessions, because they could not be taken back. It did not take long for the outside world to remember us. I rode into town for supplies and felt the weight of glances sharpen, curiosity edging into disapproval. Mrs. Dorrance watched me from the mercantile steps, her mouth set with judgment she did not bother hiding. I heard Eliza's name spoken softly behind me, followed by laughter that lacked warmth. I finished my business and left, the air tight in my chest, knowing those whispers would not stay contained. When I returned, Eliza knew before I spoke. She always did. That evening, she packed her few belongings with practiced speed, hands trembling only slightly. She said she would not be the reason I became a cautionary tale, that I deserved peace more than scandal. Her words struck deeper than anger ever could. I told her the town had never given me peace, only distance, and that distance had never felt like safety until she arrived. Still, doubt lingered in her eyes, shaped by years of being sent away. The storm came that night, sudden and unforgiving. Wind clawed at the cabin, snow piling faster than the roof could shed it. Eliza collapsed while carrying water, her body giving in where pride had held it upright. I lifted her without hesitation, fear burning away restraint, and carried her to the bed nearest the fire. She drifted in and out, murmuring apologies, while I stayed awake, feeding the flames, listening to the storm argue with the walls. In the long hours before dawn, I spoke the truth I had never rehearsed. I told her I had lived my life believing solitude was all I could manage, that love was a language meant for other men. I told her that her presence had unsettled me, not because it threatened my peace, but because it revealed how thin that peace had been. When her eyes opened, clear despite exhaustion, she looked at me not with gratitude, but with something steadier. She said she had spent years thinking she was something to be endured, never chosen, and that leaving was easier than hoping. We stayed like that, words tapering into silence that no longer felt empty. By morning, the storm eased, leaving the world hushed and bright. Eliza slept, her breathing even, and I understood that whatever waited beyond the trees would not define what stood within them. When she woke, I told her she could stay, not as a guest, not as charity, but because I wanted her there. She nodded, tears slipping free without shame, and for the first time, she did not look toward the door. Spring arrived slowly, patient as forgiveness. Snow retreated from the clearing, and sunlight found its way into corners long kept dim. We worked side by side, our routines merging until it was hard to remember how they had ever been separate. When we rode into town together, heads turned, but I did not release her hand. Some looks softened, others hardened, yet none of them carried the weight they once had. We were not asking to be understood. At night, when the fire burned low and the mountains held their breath, Eliza would rest her head against my shoulder, and I would feel the quiet certainty of something earned. I never claimed the past had been healed, only that it no longer ruled us. Love had not arrived with thunder or vows, but with shelter, choice, and the courage to stay. If there is a lesson in our story, it is this. Sometimes happiness begins when you stop believing you must face the cold alone, and allow yourself to be seen, chosen, and held.